If we have an agency like the Department of Health that will now make a law that affects 19 million New Yorkers, and it's so broad and it's so unconstitutional in its nature, then where is the people's voice in that? The people's voice has been extinguished because the agency is overstepping its bounds. It doesn't have the authority to make this regulation. And so we have to stop that.
All right, good morning. Yeah, good morning still. During the pandemic, we saw the absolute breakdown of the separation of powers here in New York State. Unfortunately, many of our colleagues were willing accomplices in that, creating a dictatorship in the name of public health and safety. We've seen the fallout of that time after time, but now we have a new issue. This whole absolute power, the governor taking on not only the role of the executive but the legislative branch, is continuing on now. And in this case, it's far worse because it's being done largely below the radar by the Department of Health to promulgate rules that are a clear violation of the separation of powers. Back in 2020, March of 2020, the legislature voted to give our former governor those emergency powers, and now here we are 2 years later, and we are still fighting to restore the checks and balances that need to be restored here in state government. So today, what we are talking about is these rules. In fact, right now, the Department of Health is meeting to discuss these rules. The whole idea that a public health official could quarantine someone, isolate them, move them to a detention center, essentially, with no due process and with no evidence that this person is a public health threat. Now, why is that important? I think it should be obvious, it should be important to every New Yorker why this is a problem. But for us, as members of the state legislature, this should have been taken up by the legislature with a bill to be discussed and debated. And in fact, there was a bill like that, Assembly Bill 416 by Assemblywoman Perry. It's actually been around for years, long before the pandemic. And it basically would give power to public health officials to isolate and quarantine someone without due process. And where did that bill go? It went nowhere. In fact, the sponsor finally pulled it recently because of all the backlash and the controversy. So now, essentially, the governor is taking most of the language from Assembly Bill 416 and trying to make it a permanent part of the New York State Department of Health regulations. This is a bill that was not popular, obviously, and never had a matching piece in the Senate. And now the governor wants to make this law. It is a clear violation of the separation of powers. For me, if this is something that the New York State Legislature, we are representing the people of New York State, wants to do, then bring it forward as a bill. Have it debated and discussed. Pass it. You be the one to tell the people that you report to, the people that elect you, that you voted to have someone quarantined without due process. And if that passes muster, then so be it. But not as a regulation put forth under the radar by Governor Hochul and her Department of Health. We filed a lawsuit, myself, Assemblyman Tague, Assemblyman Lawler, with Attorney Bobbie Anne Flower-Cox. She's here today also to speak. And we're going to talk about the specifics of that lawsuit and why it's important and why we feel that is a clear violation of the separation of powers and unconstitutional. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Assemblyman Mike Lawler.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to all my colleagues for being here, and to Bobbie Anne Cox for working with us to bring this lawsuit forward. Think of the absurdity of what we're talking about. Those who commit violent crimes are being released without bail. Those who may be sick would forcibly be taken from their homes and quarantined under this regulation. Commit a violent offense, walk free on the street. Have a health issue, be quarantined at a detention facility under government control. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd what we're talking about here. This piece of legislation that my colleague mentioned, A416. When I took office January 1st, 2021, that was the very first piece of legislation that my office was inundated with questions and concerns about. People were freaking out that that bill might actually see the light of day. Well, come to find out, some 15 months later, that Comrade Kathy Hochul thinks this is a good idea. And as we've seen, our current governor seems to be unaware of a lot of things, just based on her own comments. But what she should be aware about is that this proposal by the Department of Health is totally unconstitutional. It is a violation of our freedoms and our rights, and it must be defeated. And that is why Senator Borrello, Assemblyman Tague, and myself have brought this lawsuit forward, because we must restore legislative authority. Andrew Cuomo took unilateral control of the pandemic response in the state of New York, and we saw how that turned out. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers died needlessly because of his disastrous response to the pandemic. His $5.1 million blood money book deal, where he claimed victory over the pandemic, where he talked about how he single-handedly saved New York, well, that was a disgrace. Unfortunately, Governor Hochul is continuing down his path, and it must be stopped. We are a co-equal branch of government. We are not Kathy's minions. We're not here to do her bidding. We're here to represent the people of the state of New York, the people who elected us to be their voice in Albany. And that's what we're doing here today. We are fighting back against one-party rule. We are fighting back against an executive that has absolutely overreached. And we are here to restore legislative authority. And so we will continue to fight, and we will see this lawsuit through to the end. And with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Assemblyman Chris Tague.
Good morning. I'm Assemblyman Chris Tague, and I approve this message. I want to thank you for joining us in standing against this dangerous mandate. This policy, and the way it's progressed sneakily through the bureaucratic process, embodies the worst fears that people have about government. Did the governor really think people were just going to sit back and accept this? Accept a policy that allows the government to take people out of their homes and away from their families against their will? If she was really expecting that she could quietly sneak this power grab past us, she was dead wrong. And that's why I have joined Senator Borrello and Assemblyman Lawler in their lawsuit against this unconstitutional policy. The role of the legislature is to engage in spirited debates and deeply scrutinize proposals that have the ability to directly affect the lives of our residents, like this one does. But since this policy has been treated as a regulatory matter, we have not been afforded the opportunity. And it should be clear to all of us that this isn't a simple matter of rulemaking, and that while I am very happy to rise to the challenge of fighting this policy, it is mind-boggling that something of this nature was ever put forward by the governor's health department. It's outlandish proposals like this that give the darkest fears that people hold about our government, and that wear on the credibility of earnest efforts to help people and protect public safety. If the governor truly cared about protecting public health, she would have no part in advancing policies as frightening as this one. We're here to put a stop to it today. I want to thank all of you for your support and for taking a stand against the nightmarish government overreach. This rule should be renewed and should have never been proposed to begin with. And I want to close with this. I want to close with some quotes from the 40th President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan. President Reagan once said, "Government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives." Government is not the solution to problems. Government is the problem. And lastly, either you will control your government or government will control you. My friends, we live in the greatest country in the history of the world. We need to control our government. We need to control our freedom. And we must live by a constitution. God bless each and every one of you. Stop the overreach of our Constitution and the residents and people of New York State. God bless you all, and thank you.
We'd like to thank you very much. I'd like to also introduce Assemblywoman Jodi Giglio, who was just testifying at that Department of Health hearing. Jodi.
Not only was I testifying in person, as every member of the public had to appear in person for this public hearing, where members of the Health Planning Council were able to zoom in. Is that democracy? No. Why are they not held to the same standards? I delivered to the Health Council a petition with 10,263 signatures this morning demanding a public hearing on these issues that State Administrative Procedures Act Authority is reviewing, and they are shoving down our throats. But the constitutional rights of the New Yorkers and Constitution of the United States are being trampled over every single day. We must continue to push back, and we must fight for our rights. With the mask mandates, with the mandatory vaccinations, with the nursing home deaths, they're talking about putting people that are at risk and that have a communicable disease in a location, an undescribed location. I had to ask the question of the Health Council if that included camps. Are they planning on putting everybody that they think is a health risk into camps? I did not get an answer to my question. But this is what's happening, folks. We are going way back into the history of the United States of America, and it's really going the wrong way. You know, we wrote a letter to the governor back in January with the minority members of the legislature demanding public hearings, demanding that the Department of Health have the public hearings, and what did they do? They adopted legislation making it harder for people to sign a petition and get a public hearing. Instead of 125 signatures, you now need 750 signatures in order to request a public hearing. Instead of the public comment period ending on the day the public comment period ends, it used to be 20 days, now it's 60 days. This is wrong. We are going in the wrong direction, and we are shutting out New Yorkers, and we're here. I stand with my colleagues to fight and push back. And I want to thank Senator Borrello and also Assemblyman Lawler for putting this lawsuit forward. Thank you.
We have one more speaker to call up. Before I do, I just want to point out something that I think is important that people understand. The purpose of this lawsuit is without a doubt the separation of powers. But the real impact of this law is this. A local public health official could say, go to a 12-year-old's house and say, I believe, with no proof, that your child has a communicable disease, and we're taking him somewhere. The parents, where are you taking him? We'll let you know. When's he going to come back? We'll let you know. That's what this regulation would do. And the purpose of it being a legislative initiative, we can debate these bills and get the intent of the sponsor to say, is this something you would allow? And I would hope that anyone who's less than a communist would say, no, we would not allow that. And that is the basis for changes to the law and for a lawsuit and for the ability for someone to actually retrieve their child in that situation. That will not happen because this is not a law. This is a regulation put forth by the executive. And again, a clear violation of the separation of powers. With that, I'm going to introduce the attorney that is handling this, and that's Bobbie Anne Cox.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'd like to first start by thanking Senator Borrello and thanking Assemblyman Tague and Assemblyman Lawler. And Uniting New York State, they are the citizens group that is on the lawsuit with these three legislators. I really want to emphasize that this is a lawsuit that is so important to the people of New York because as we've heard these legislators state this morning, this is about separation of powers. We have three branches of government, and the people suffer when one of those branches oversteps its bounds and crosses over into lawmaking where they don't belong. The people of New York can't have their voices heard if an agency is passing a law. That's why we have representation in the legislature, because the people of New York choose these people to represent them, to represent their voices, and to let them be heard in the lawmaking process. So if we have an agency like the Department of Health that will now make a law that affects 19 million New Yorkers, and it's so broad, and it's so unconstitutional in its nature, then where is the people's voice in that? The people's voice has been extinguished because the agency is overstepping its bounds. It doesn't have the authority to make this regulation. And so we have to stop that. We have to ask the court to put the executive branch back into its lane and let the legislature speak. If the legislators want to pass a law that will require people who may have a communicable disease to be isolated or quarantined, then the legislature will do that. That is not a role for an agency. It is not the role of the executive branch of our government. A416 was a bill that was proposed for many years, as Senator Borrello had mentioned earlier, and it went nowhere because the people of New York were so opposed to it, and their legislators had that voice and were able to say, no, you know what, we're not going to support this bill. But when you take that language of that bill and you put it into a regulation through an agency, the people lose their voice. And so this is why we're bringing this lawsuit. And I thank everybody for coming today. I thank all of these legislators for being here in support. And I thank Uniting New York State, the citizens group that's also behind the lawsuit. I see many of the members here today, and I know many of them were giving comment inside at the Department of Health hearing. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. One last thing I want to point out. A416, there are 213 members of the state legislature in the Senate, the Assembly. Guess how many people were on that bill? One. 20 million people in New York State and only one legislator, and it went nowhere. And now it's going to become the rules and regulations of the Department of Health in New York State. Is there anything that is less representative than that? It's outrageous. So with that, we'll take any questions you might have. During the pandemic, we saw the absolute breakdown of the separation of powers here in New York State. Unfortunately, many of our colleagues were willing accomplices in that, creating a dictatorship in the name of public health and safety.